Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I should ask, how you doing up there?
I'm doing great.
Yeah?
I actually don't think great. I'm usually doing quite well, and today I'm elated. A lot of good stuff happening.
That was a strong statement right out of the gate.
Feeling powerfully good.
I thought what might make you feel great is what you were drinking. Do you want to tell me about it?
Yes, I'm happy to tell you about it. I am drinking one of my favorite drinks of all time, and that is the classic Mai Tai.
I know. Actually, you turned me on to this drink years ago.
Yeah.
That's true. What's the rooftop / pool bar in LA that you sent me to? Like very adamantly sent me to.
No, it's not rooftop. It's the old Trader Vic's that used to be in the Beverly Hilton.
But it's still by the pool.
Is that? Did they move it over now?
I ended up.
Do you know I spent many hours after teaching LSAT classes in Trader Vic's drinking Mai Tais?
I do know that, but I'm so glad you just made it public.
Well, you think I'd be embarrassed about that?
No. There wasn't any part of me that was like, oh, he'll be embarrassed to admit it. No, it's just...
I'm never embarrassed about stuff like
Anyone
that.
who could find themselves in this direction, please go to the Trader Vic's. It's truly worth it.
Well, the drink that I am drinking, I actually had far too many of these on Saturday night. We were taste testing, and Amanda is, of course,
Amanda's
an ace.
his wife, if anyone's wondering.
Yes, my wife is an ace drink mixer, and she
really
just crushed it out of the park.
Yeah, I've spent Thanksgiving with you guys. She's better at everything than you, and I just adore her.
I've got the LSAT on her, I think.
You got a 7-year-old creeping up. Watch out.
Yeah, she's next. She made a bunch of these on Saturday, and she kept warning me. She's like, they're full of alcohol. And I was like, yeah, just make another. And then on Sunday, I totally regretted that decision because I felt it. But I know you're feeling it today because you got friends in town. So what are you drinking?
Well, I have mutual friends, and I am feeling it. I'm exhausted. We've got a good pal of mine. I hope he listens to this and has some sense of remorse.
He won't.
He won't. One of our good buddies from Las Vegas is in town, and he has sent me straight back to a bottle. I'm drinking a Bloody Mary.
I don't like Bloody Marys.
I don't either.
Why are you drinking one then?
It's penance. I don't really know. Yeah.
Hair of the dog kind of?
Yeah, something like that. I'm not happy about it. But it's
not even morning. You'd be better off with this Mai Tai I have.
You might be right.
Anyway.
No one's ever been happy about a Bloody Mary. Just occasionally they become necessary.
Some people love them. They really do. Especially people who like, spicy, hotter foods. They can get it really spiced
maybe that's
up.
my problem. I'm an absolute wimp when it comes to spices.
I've gotten better.
Have you?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'd say challenge accepted, but I'm not one to challenge you. So
I'm not like at Carolina Reaper level, but I'm actually like
reference.
I can handle some Scovilles.
Serious Scoville. Well done. Let's get back to something that you and I think can maybe be on the same page about.
Yes.
What are you listening to?
Music today is thematically connected, as always, to the topic. And today we're going to talk about conditional reasoning and how to think about it, how to approach it, how to kind of like place it into your technique and technical approaches to this exam. And we know that it's one of those concepts that people fall in love with. And as we'll talk about, it's all over the test, and it's easy to fall in love with it. And because of that, I always think about it as being a little bit dangerous. Yeah. And consequently, the song that we have chosen is by a band called Big Data, and it is indeed called Dangerous. Yeah. Kind of a controversial song choice, I'd say.
That's a good way to put it.
You want to go to sleep now?
Yes.
You sound like you're ready to just go to bed.
I'm deeply ready. But this song probably wouldn't put me there. This is a song that actually I want to put a disclaimer on.
Do it.
You feel okay about it? All right.
No, but do
it. This is one of those songs that probably pushes the envelope a little bit. At least the video does. Yeah?
Yeah.
No? Not for you?
We're all adults. I don't think it's that.
I know we're all. I mean, it's
I'm an
weird
adult.
to classify
about you.
myself as such. But this video is a little bit boundary pushing.
Very minor, man.
Come on. Anyway, if you're going to watch this video, adults only, I don't really know how to frame it. No?
You know, I would love to put a poll up and see what everyone else thought. To me, I'm
I
like,
would
it
too,
is what
actually.
it is.
I really would be curious. So if you watch this video, if you listen to this podcast and want to give us some feedback,
Please do.
Please do.
Tell me it's fine, or yeah, that's not safe for work.
Would
I don't even think
you
an
do me
approach
the
is not
favor
safe
and
for
say
work.
that Dave is wrong? I live for these moments.
They happen so rarely.
Oh, shut up.
Let's move on and talk about the LSAT, man.
Yes.
I'm feeling great about the test these days.
Me too.
Obviously, a lot more of them coming down the pike. But one of the things that is starting to come out is that the October LSAT is the one you can register for now. And the registration is turning into be a little bit troublesome because there are not as many centers as there normally
I've
are
heard about this
for these tests.
every day. Literally
Yeah.
every day.
We've been itching to talk about it because I've tweeted it and I'm like, go out and sign up as soon as you possibly can, because it's not just that there's not as many centers, they're filling up more quickly because of that. So you kind of get it coming and
Yeah,
going.
naturally. I mean, if you
Yeah,
can't,
that makes total sense.
can't get in the place you want, you're going to get in the place you go. There you go.
And I think we keep getting asked, why is this the case? Is LSAC trying to screw us? Okay, I don't think they are.
Succinct.
And I think people know that I would be honest, that if I felt like they were, that I would say so. I don't think that's what's happening.
Are you suggesting that we occasionally are gentle with LSAC?
No, I'm suggesting that I speak the truth about them whenever it's presented to me.
Yes, we do.
To give an opinion.
And this is one of those cases where, can you really tell me why?
Sure, I can give you some theories.
I have some theories too.
My usual approach to this is, if I think LSAC's done something wrong, I will say so. And I'm very much an advocate for student rights in this process, and I believe that the student should come first. And that doesn't always happen. And here, I'm hoping maybe they'll open up a few centers, because I think what has occurred is July was really big as a test. And so
surprisingly so.
Surprisingly so, much bigger than they expected. And I think they thought that that would maybe make it so the rest of the year there were fewer test takers. But it's also a case where there are more LSATs now. And if you're giving more LSATs, naturally you don't need the same number of centers each time. So I think they pared it down for that reason. And that is probably the biggest driver of, we don't need as many centers. But you go to some of these cities and you're like, this is a pretty big city, and I don't see more than like one center, maybe two. That's not enough. So maybe they'll open up a few extra. Obviously, they see the demand that's going through, and if they see a bunch of cities that are full...
What do you think happens for people who've maybe enrolled in a center that wasn't their first choice, and then their city opens up?
They're probably going to have to pay the transfer fee.
Yeah.
Which I don't find to be fair.
I agree with you, and I also agree with you.
Yeah. I think there's another possible cause here, is they may have pared down the centers in relation to the digital test, because you want to have the best proctors handling these events.
Fair.
It was, as was proven last time, it's easy to have difficulty with it.
Yeah, and if you aren't sure what we're talking about, please go listen to our episode on the July digital rollout.
And also the last thing is the free retake drew people into July. They still haven't clarified the policy. I hope that they will. I have an inquiry into them right now to get complete clarification whether or not you can retroactively apply your free coupon after signing up for the October test. I'm hoping that you will be allowed to do so.
Are you talking about September?
I'm talking about October.
Well, we know that October is applicable.
They told us that, but now people are being told on the phone that, no, it doesn't work that way. And so I reached out through official channels to say, let's clarify this and get the answer.
Interesting.
So, yeah, if you go online, you can see a lot of people upset about it, and I understand why. But it's also driving the problem here with the number of centers in October, is that free retake, people want to use it, so they went and they signed up for these tests, and now there's just not enough spaces.
Sure.
So,
well, on that happy note,
yes, the only other thing that
we rain
really
sunshine
happened
on everyone. anyone's day.
That's just, sign up now if you haven't for the October test. And maybe consider signing up for the next test if you know you're going to take that one, or if you have a future test that you want to take.
That's November, by the way.
Yeah. The other thing that happened was that Kelly Testy, who is the head of LSAC, she posted an article on the Tax Prof blog, which is it's a pretty famous legal blog. It's run by, I think it's Paul Karen, and he's the dean of Pepperdine. So I don't think when he started that blog he was the dean, but he is now. And they catch all these different articles and cover all sorts of legal things and LSAT related things. But her article really just summarizes the year. Now that she's reached the end of July, they have pretty much all the data. And so she talks a little bit about the increase in applicants and things like that. It's an interesting enough article. We'll link it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through every little detail of it because I don't think that helps us.
Let's really
No. I'm going to put my foot down.
You should.
I know you want to hear about the 62,427 applicants to U.S. law schools, which represents a 3.3% increase over last year.
I've already fallen asleep.
Exactly. Now I see what your ultimate purpose here is.
It was for you to sing me a law school lullaby.
Well, let's move out of that because that's pretty much all that's going on right now. Sign up for October if you're going to take it. Sign up immediately. Let's talk about conditional reasoning, man.
Let's get right into it. And I suppose the place to start is to talk about how we know. How do you even know you're in the presence of conditional reasoning?
Well, maybe we should say first, since that wasn't clearly defined. No.
All right.
What is it?
Well, honestly, it's tomato. You're saying the same thing. How do we know?
But more succinctly and efficiently.
You're in a mood. Go ahead.
First off, when we talk about conditional reasoning, we use a bunch of interchangeable terms. You'll hear us say conditional reasoning.
Okay.
You'll hear us talk about conditionality. You'll hear us say something about sufficient and necessary conditions. That all means the same type of relationship. And it is really what a lot of people describe as the if-then relationship. If this thing happens, then something else happens. And the many variations in the ways you can say that, the inferences that can be drawn, the arguments that can be formed around that, that is what conditional reasoning is. Do you take issue with my description?
I mean, I take issue with almost everything, but no, not in this case. I think that's actually pretty well said.
Thank you.
What we're talking about collectively is the idea of how do you know when conditional reasoning is present? And I think you've done a good job at trying to supersede me.
Yes, I had to step to the front of the line to speak because I couldn't tell where you were going.
Ouch.
Now, one of the big things about this type of reasoning is, I would say, it is the signature form of reasoning used on the LSAT.
I agree with that.
It doesn't mean it's the only one. Obviously, another big one is causality. There's many flawed forms of reasoning. Sure. But it is the signature form, and you find it all over the place in logical reasoning as well as logic games. If you're not good at conditional reasoning, if you're not really fluent and fluid with it, you've got trouble because you're going to see games where there are conditional rules and maybe whole games that are just a series of conditional rules. You're dead in the water.
Can I put some percentages on this?
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's around, roughly the last estimation, 16% of logical reasoning and about 35% of logic games.
Now, when you're saying that, though, you're actually referring to the idea of like this game is all conditional versus...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Again.
How dare you?
I'll stop talking at this point.
I am talking about the idea of its presence. I think about 1 in 3 games have conditional reasoning to some degree. About 1 in 6 or 7 questions in logical reasoning.
I must have heard you backwards. I thought you said 16% in logic games, and I was like, that's way too low.
No, 16% or so in logical reasoning. Sorry.
Okay.
If I said it backwards, and anyone who wants to play the tape back.
And I will.
I know you will.
And if you're wrong, I'm just going to record it.
That's my bad.
and then I'll just
you know
send
what?
it to you as a text every
No,
once in a
it's
while.
fine. I was due. It's like once a year. It's fine.
No, but think about that. A third of what you're seeing is based upon this conditional reasoning. And so you're going to see it everywhere. And what we're really saying is that's the important usage of it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a second.
Yeah, this is one of the key points, which is that's when it matters. It also appears in almost every question in some way or another, because a lot of the words that indicate conditionality are also used to talk about other forms of reasoning or to introduce conditional ideas that aren't central. So even though we say it only occurs in like this percentage, that's when it was actually the critical component or a critical component. It occurs all over the place. And this actually creates a real problem for students who learn conditional reasoning. Because if you start looking at conditional problems, what you discover is if you've never encountered it before, it looks like magic. You're like, it works like that? If I know this, A goes to B, and then what they did is they said B, and then they concluded A, and that's the mistake, and I just have to find that. It's kind of like you've entered the Disneyland of the LSAT world. You're like, yay, this works so well. And all of a sudden, everybody who's encountered it like that, they start to look for it everywhere. Well, that's so simple. When I see it, I will mark it down and then I'll solve the problem using that. And the difficulty, and the reason we're even talking about this and entitling the episode, thinking about it, is because that doesn't always work because it's not always central to what's happening. And if it's not central, you then end up focusing on something that is not really overly helpful to solving the problem.
Man, you were doing such a good job. I'm just going to have a drink. And you just keep going.
I should.
Yeah, you should.
Because you don't look like you're doing too well over there.
All right. You're killing it was the compliment. And you find a way to make it an insult.
This is,
you're not wrong.
To me, this is class time. And, this is like how I would teach a class. So without the interruptions from the gallery.
Well, all right. The gallery.
You're the gallery at this point.
I knew who I was.
So this is one of the things that you always have to really warn people about. Be like, it's beautiful. Yeah. When it works well and it's central, it is the coolest thing.
You know what it reminds me of, Dave, a little bit? To just completely interrupt you because...
Yes, to cut me off completely, thank you.
I'm tired of hearing you talk. Is the template discussion that we just had.
Yep.
It's a little bit like that.
I was actually going to mention that.
Well, were you?
I was. Okay. It's also another thing that people like to go to Disneyland about. They're like, this works so great. I'm going to do every game with it. It's like, careful.
Yeah.
It's not always the entrance to Disneyland.
It becomes so enamoring that it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's seductive
in
its power.
Such a good way to put it. You were hanging on that one. You were ready.
No, I wasn't hanging on it. Anyway, so when we think about this, it's pervasive. It's everywhere on the exam. We know we're going to see a lot of it. But part of what we need to do is to ascertain when it is going to be a major part of the argument.
So how do you know that it's there and that it's like important?
Let's start with that because I think that's a great place to go. The easiest way is to understand the basic indicators that are used to convey each of these ideas. Now, in conditional reasoning, there's two really big pieces. There's a sufficient condition and there's a necessary condition.
Well, those are the two those are the two things that matter, right?
Those are the two big pieces. Sure. You can have multiples of each, which we're not going to really go into depth on right now. We will in the future. But those are the two major components of conditional reasoning. And every conditional statement, that is a fully formed conditional statement, has both pieces. Sure. So
let's talk about what each one is. Let's talk about how to recognize them. We're in the presence, etc.
Yeah. So how would you define, say a sufficient or necessary condition?
The way that I tend to teach this idea to people is in stages. And we're only going to cover the first couple today.
All right.
Which is recognition, identification, assignment. And then we'll get more into like chain relationships and weird variations. Multiple, sufficient, necessary, that sort of thing. We'll get into that later. How would I identify the pieces? Well, the beauty of this, to me, is that you can actually start to look at sufficient and necessary through very different lenses. And if you can identify one versus the other, the construction of just the language of it, I think allows for you to have an easier perception.
Okay.
That's how I think.
Agree with you.
Okay. So far, so good.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's talk about sufficient first, and then we'll talk about necessary, and there's no particular order to this. But the way that I see a sufficient condition is all about catalyst. It's all about something that tells me another thing. So if I see an idea, a scenario, a situation that would tell me something else is true, I know that I'm in the presence of a sufficient condition.
Agreed.
I'm waiting on you.
Okay. I'm waiting on you to finish.
All right.
You know, I like that definition, and I feel the same way about it. To me, I sometimes think about it as the falling domino. It's the first domino, and then it knocks another
trigger,
one
right?
down.
It's an indicator. Yeah. When this first thing happens, I know more stuff.
I've sometimes called it a sign that when you know that the sufficient has happened, it is a sign that the other condition has happened.
Perfect. I love it.
And so there's different ways to do it. You know, from a trigger standpoint, same kind of idea. The one thing that I always caution people on this is don't think that the sufficient made the necessary condition happen. You're talking about the
distinction between causality and conditionality.
Exactly. Important. It's not making it happen. It just tells you that it has happened.
Yes.
So that's why we use arrows to diagram this, usually an arrow that is going from left to right, although it doesn't really matter the direction. And what we put at the so-called front of the arrow is the sufficient condition, because when you know that's happened, you can then track down the arrow and say,
yeah, it's a pathway,
all right, what's
it's a trail, there's a destination.
Yes, and that destination is the necessary condition.
Beautiful. Let's talk about that.
Let's indeed talk about it.
The necessary condition. I think people get a little too hung up, and you, again, may want to fight me on this. People get a little too hung up on the idea of requirement. I just see it as outcome. Outcome in the sense of it's the thing you know, not outcome in the sense of like effect.
Okay.
Heavy.
I get where you're going with that.
Pause for you to weigh.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to the causality aspect.
Yeah. I don't want to impress upon people the idea that it was something that was, again, an outcome or a forceful effect. That's not what I mean. A consequence.
You're not thinking about it as consequence.
No. Instead, what I mean is it's just a truth you can know.
And this is where the necessity idea comes in. I mean, the name of the condition itself is indicative of what's happening. It's the thing that has to happen.
Do you take my point that I think the notion of requirement is sometimes overemphasized?
I do, and now I'm going to emphasize how important it is.
That's fantastic, by the way. That's fantastic.
I am not the guy who is going to.
Like I said, I didn't expect us to agree on every point of this.
No, and this is one of those ones where I'm like, I'm not so sure that I follow your idea of outcome. The easiest way to start with this idea, though, is to think about the fact that it has to occur. That if the sufficient condition occurs, it's irrevocably the case that the necessary condition is going to occur.
It is unavoidable.
Yeah. Now, it's not causal. It's not that the sufficient makes the necessary happen. And it's just that the necessary is going to happen or will happen for sure at some point. So literally when we look at that kind of relationship, you have to take that idea of the absolutism of it, and you can use that to understand the language that they refer to it with and how sentences that don't have, clear indicators work. I often rely upon that. One of the cool things, though, is that as we talk about this, you might notice that it's difficult for us to talk about one condition without referring to the other.
That is a really interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah, these
two things being like intrinsically interconnected.
Exactly. That's a very nice way to say that they have this deep connection that you can't separate them out. At least once you have an actual statement.
Right.
To define one to the other, you're like, well, it relates back to the other one. So we always end up talking about these two things together. And that's because they are connected. If the sufficient happens, you know the necessary happened. The necessary is the thing that needs to happen if the sufficient is going to successfully occur.
Sure. And we're going to get to this point, but I want to put a disclaimer on this now.
Okay.
You'll indulge me. Which is to say, these two things happening together is not the same thing as these two things being a partnership or a pair or being, like, again, unavoidably connected. They can exist independently.
Right.
And we will get there. But I want to put that on there early.
They can exist independently once or at some point when you have an actual full statement.
We'll see those exceptions, those moments, whatever. But to me, when I think about conditionality, what I tend to think about is like one of these things tells me another. It's indicative, but that's as far as I can take it. And I'm very cautious about the degree to which I can really indulge this relationship.
Okay.
That's how I feel.
Very good then. So let's talk about the indicators that tell us a little bit about each type.
I like it.
When you take a look at the words that introduce sufficient ideas, they tend to be very different in a lot of respects than the words that introduce necessary ideas. The sufficiency, the first biggest word is if. If this thing happens, and that's where you start your conditional relationship. But you also see words like all and every and when, and they're very much kind of built upon the idea of whether or not there's an occurrence or whether everybody in a particular group or area or what have you, something where it's like they're able to apply a characteristic to an entire set or an occurrence to an entire set. It starts it off like all of the people wearing red shirts today. All right, so now we have this group and it's going to apply to all of them. And once I see someone who has that red shirt on, I'm going to know something else about them. That if, then, all, every, these kinds of things. This is what sets up like a sufficiency idea. Whereas when you get to necessary, it's usually, you said consequence before was something we wanted to avoid, but like then, as a result, something like then is going to be a necessary idea, but also like must, have to, required.
And as long as people can distinguish that from a forceful outcome, then I think it's okay.
A forced outcome.
Yeah.
So
there's no impact, there's no action.
Right. So as we look at these words and sentences, when I see words like that, it automatically cues me that, hey, there's a conditional relationship going around. Now, do I need indicators that indicate each one? No, because these are so closely related. As soon as I get one, it typically tells me that the other is in existence as well. Somebody who says something like, oh, to get to Dallas, you must take a car. Well, that car is going to be the necessary idea. Right. And that tells me that the other part, the Dallas part, that must be the sufficient. I didn't have the best indicator on the Dallas part, but I had a really great indicator on the car part, and I was able to use that. So it's not something where you're like, I have to have both sides of it. You just need one. And as soon as you have that one, you can figure out the entire relationship.
You're describing to me one of the key points of this, which is the assignment of role or the assignment of name. How do you know the difference in sufficient versus necessary?
Okay.
Right. Okay. I'll continue.
Just waiting to see where you're going.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a worthwhile, obviously, talking point. One of the things that I try to do with people in classes or whatever, tutoring, is try to help them see this more clearly. How is it that you can tell? How is it that you can assign a sufficient versus a necessary relationship? That's where I'm going with this. We're going to explore it because I insist.
Well, the first and the easiest way is know the indicators.
That does help. But language is a slippery thing.
Let's go back. I don't want to just say that it helps. I want this point to actually be entirely clear.
I like your insistence.
I'm not talking about somebody who's been a philosophy major for the last 4 years and who's like, I understand this. They don't need to go back and memorize things like that. They already know it from the work that they've done. I'm talking about somebody who, like most people, arrives at this point of the LSAT with no prior education about conditional reasoning. And it's confusing. They're like, how do I know which one is which? It's a real challenge. This is what I always say. Start off and memorize the indicator lists.
Okay.
We have them in the Logical Reasoning Bible, for example. We have them in our courses. Go memorize them. The reason is simple. That actually takes care of like over 90 or 95% of the problems that you'll run into.
Can I ask?
Once you know that,
perfect.
The vast majority of what you're doing, you can handle it very easily. Now, that doesn't mean every sentence is simple. It doesn't mean that every sentence has an indicator to it. But those are more the exception as opposed to the rule. And knowing the indicators puts you in a position where you're like, all right, I'm now actually in charge of the vast majority of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I think the vast majority is going to be where we live today.
Yeah.
Let me ask you two potential exceptions. What about sentences where they don't occur? And what about cases where they're used deceptively?
Those are both learning experiences for the people, because sometimes you look at a sentence and later on you're like, oh, I didn't see any indicators, so I just went past it. But remember, if you understand the definition of sufficiency and necessity, you can begin to see them indicating these ideas without using the classic words. And this is why I always say start by knowing the indicators and just memorizing this stuff. And then as time goes on, learn the logic behind it, learn the nature of the relationships behind it, because then you'll be able to sense those occurrences more easily and they won't slip it past you.
Right.
So both of those, to me, what I always tell students when they're studying is if you run into a sentence that you missed or you didn't realize had this or was used in a deceptive way, write it down. Because what you'll begin to discover is that there are patterns to this. They kept doing the same thing over and over. And after you saw it 4 times, you're like, I'm not going to miss that again. There's the word only, for example. I'm not going to go into a deep discussion of it, but I think we've got a blog that's, talks about the differences between only if, and the only. Mm-hmm. It's in, we've kind of adapted it and put it into some of our course materials and so forth. And that, just the different words around only change the way that it's used. And that can be really tricky because it looks deceptive. If somebody says, well, if is a sufficient condition indicator, all right, and only, which happens to be a necessary condition indicator. All right, I got that. That's really clear. Okay, now here's your third sentence, and it has only if in it. What do I do?
Yeah.
If you've never studied this before, you can imagine that during the LSAT, you're like, I'm screwed. Or you're just going to be like, okay, it's got if, so it must be sufficient. No, it turns out that the only overpowers the if, and only if is a necessary condition. So you have to know that beforehand. And this actually gets to a point that is next on our list, which is it really bothers me when someone says, I'm pretty good at conditional reasoning, but, I don't know all the indicators. I'm not, I don't know everything. I just kind of wing it. I'm like, I hope you're really good, because if there's something that you can know with certainty prior to the test and you choose not to learn it, or you're too lazy to actually memorize it, as the case may be, you deserve to miss questions, which is a harsh sentiment.
I mean, that's a real hard statement. But I take your point. Look, if you're willing to give away points, you don't deserve them.
If you can know this and you choose not to learn it beforehand, that's your fault. And you've seen me. I get this way when it comes to like the actual learning of this test. I'm like, I know it's hard. I know it's a pain. I know that sometimes it is boring. I apologize for all those things.
But if you can know it, know it.
You got to know it. And by the way, when you get to law school, it's going to get worse.
Boy, you're cutting no corners today, boy.
You have problems. Oh, yeah, I'm on fire with this. But I feel really strongly about it because sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't realize the way unless worked. And I'm like,
tough luck.
Okay, that's on you.
Yeah.
It's out there. You can learn it. We make a big deal about it. And, oh, I didn't realize without worked the same way. I'm like, again, on you. This has been asked and answered, as they say in depositions, and covered. And so I want to make sure that when people start off with this, that they're really clear on the idea of, I need to know the indicators.
Love it.
And from there is a difference to me between I know it and it's second nature.
Right. It's innate. It's intuitive. And I think that's where we're really trying to take people.
Yes. The key is not for you to say, oh, hey, I know this conditional indicator. I know only if. Let me think about it for a second. Okay, yeah, that's right. It's a necessary condition. Okay, good for you to know what it was. Bad for you to be so slow at analyzing it.
The fact that you had to think about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The word that I talk about is often like, it becomes transparent in terms of how fast you can apply this.
I like that.
It is effortless, incredibly fast, and happens so quickly you don't even recognize it. When I read sentences, typically what's happening is when conditionality comes up, I just absorb it and mentally I see the picture of what it is. I don't often stop and be like, let me diagram this out. It takes too much time. I very rarely stop and be like, what are they saying? Because from a conditional standpoint, at least, I've seen almost every variation.
Sure.
And let's be honest, they do try to throw in new variations and, curveballs. Every once in a while that happens. I'm like, let me make sure I'm clear on this. Got it.
Yeah. If they can stump you.
Everyone can do that. Yeah. It's clearly laid out. You don't have to spend $1,000 in a course to learn it. It's in the Logical Reasoning Bible, and it is all there. Yes, it is tedious at times. I'm sorry about that, but it is absolutely, I'm going to use this word, necessary for you to know it all. So it's not just to know it, though. It's to be able to recognize it and apply it instantly without second thought.
Beautiful. Yeah, I agree. So know when you're in the presence of it. And then we get to talk about the idea of basically like recognition with speed, with efficiency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's take that and move on a little bit to something that kind of, it becomes a sticking point. A lot of times what we do with these, especially early on, is that we tell people to diagram.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And that is because a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can put down that diagram and it's like, okay, that's what the relationship. This is the front of the arrow. This is the end of the arrow. I see it. And after you've worked with the arrows for a little bit, it's like, okay, makes complete sense. And that has some real positives, especially early on, and it has some negatives if you over rely on it. So I kind of want to break this down in order. What I always tell people is when you are starting out, take your time, learn it, diagram everything that you think needs to be diagrammed. Because that will do two things for you. It will make you better at diagramming and make you faster. And it will also show you when it's not being used and when it is being used. Mm-hmm. So you have this conditional stuff. Diagram away. Learn it. And the reason is this, is because if you get really great at diagramming, then you are in the enviable position of being able to say, okay, I want to diagram here. Here, I don't want to diagram. But it's your choice. You're not forced into doing it or trying to cope with anything.
You're in charge.
You're in charge. Now, what I often find, and especially when I work with students, is they'll diagram like crazy at first. And as we go through it, I'll start saying, did you need to diagram there? Oh, no, I just did it as second nature. All right, if that's the case, how fast did you do it? Was it more or less instant? Then I don't really care. Is it helping you to do that? Then keep on doing it. But what you often find is that over time, they start to diagram a little less, and then a little less, and then a little less.
Yeah, I want to actually circle back to the questions that you were just asking.
Oh, okay.
Because you are asking the key questions. Did it help you? Was it worth it? Did you speed up or slow down? These are the kinds of things that a lot of students in my experience don't ask.
They just do.
Yeah, they just default to. And it's disappointing, frankly, but you have encouraged your students to ask the questions that actually do make a difference. Should you have done that? What was the cost benefit? What was the reward on your investment?
ROI is exactly what I was thinking while you were talking.
And if you can get students to ask that question, they will come to the right answers.
The key thing, though, is, and I have sympathy, because if you're a student who's new to this, or even if you've been doing it a while and you're struggling with it, it's hard to think, well, they told me to diagram, so I need to diagram.
True.
Again, though, we're saying when it applies to do it. And so you do have to ask these questions of yourself to say, is it helping or isn't it helping?
I think that's the key, Dave, and I know you don't disagree with me, at least on this. I mean, on most things, but not on this.
Not here.
Which is the only way for a person to know for themselves is to try, right? You have to experiment. You have to test this.
I've seen students scoring 175 who diagram a ton.
You diagram way more than I do.
That's true. I do indeed. And yet I diagram less than I used to.
Well, I'm proud of your progress.
It's just a lazy habit, to be honest with you, to some extent.
I said to somebody the other day, you may or may not appreciate this, that watching the end result of your logic game was like you trying to track down your daughter's killer. It just looks, it looks psychopathic, like a madman. There's just strings attached to, like, it's crazy.
First off, this is the worst analogy.
I know, it wasn't my best.
It's the worst I've ever heard you use.
You cannot be serious about that.
Oh, yeah.
You've known me
Let's keep my daughter out of this.
All right. Fair. It's like trying to track down.
Yeah, when I diagram games.
Killer.
Yeah.
But you do a lot of work.
Yeah. But it's not work to me because I can do it so fast.
That helps.
I've learned over time how to do it. And so a lot of times what I think about is what I said before is it's a lazy habit.
Yeah.
I am actually writing stuff down so I can stop thinking about it a little bit. So to me, is it really a lazy habit? No, but this is how I visualize it in my mind, where I'm like, I'd rather just write it on the paper than just have to think about it.
But see, you've learned a way in which you can feel as though that benefits you immediately.
Oh, sure.
And I think a lot of students feel obligated to these things, and that's a mistake.
And that's why we're talking about this. It's why I have big sections in all of our materials that says to diagram or not to diagram. You don't have to diagram everything is the real message. Diagram when you think it is useful. And that's a lesson that for some people, it's almost freeing to hear that. They're like, I don't? I'm like, no, dude, every tool that you're given is about whether it benefits you. If you think it benefits you, keep on doing it. If you don't think it benefits you, do less.
And how do you know?
Practice.
Yes.
That was easy.
I know. I mean, that was an easy layup.
It's also the hardest answer because it's like, you got to go work on it.
I mean, the answer itself sucks, but the decision is like the underlying, the only way to know is practice. That's easy to say.
The answer's great. Right. The actual implications of the answer are terrible.
Yeah.
Keep drinking that Bloody Mary, man.
Hush.
But honestly, that is really the way to go. And that's what my point was, is I've seen people who have really high scores who diagram a lot, and I've seen people with really high scores who hardly diagram. And you just don't know which person you're going to be until you get there.
Yeah, perfect.
But
and conditional reasoning is, to me, the telltale thing. Like, this is it.
It says a lot. But this is also
we turn this into a logic game setup, but it's really conditional is where it lives.
Yeah, well, it lives on both. But we were talking about this before, too. You said the tendency, you're like, I diagram less. If you recall when we were talking last time, we were talking about the possibilities. And I actually tend to do that more than you do.
Oh, yeah, templates. For sure.
Yeah, it's a feature of like how I think. I tend to put more information down on the page. You tend to put less information down on the page.
My ideal LSAT is one I can turn back in without a note on it, without a single mark.
Not mine.
I know. Not anyone's. Frankly, I'm a weirdo when it comes to this.
But there's multiple
When it comes to
pathways to
most of it.
success, and that's the whole point here. So when we get to this idea of diagramming, you are not, as a student, beholden to this fact of like, I got to diagram
No,
everything.
nor am I an ideal to live up to. You have to
Definitely
find
not.
yourself. No, don't, shut up.
I was waiting for that to sink in.
It took a minute.
You're definitely not an ideal.
No, I'm so far removed from anything you should aspire to.
I might call your mother after this and tell her to listen to this
totally
section.
call my mom. Somebody needs to.
Well, so that diagramming point, I think we've beaten that into the ground, but it is a point that needs to be beaten into the ground.
Yeah,
find your level.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the actual act of diagramming.
Okay.
So let's say you have decided to diagram it. One of the biggest problems I think that people run into is trying to figure out what actually is sufficient, what is the necessary condition.
How to assign the labels.
Yeah, how to assign which one in there. Now, at least from an actual writing out standpoint, I usually just use the initials of whatever the main terms are. You don't have to get crazy with it. If there's a negative in it, I usually just put a slash over those initials. And again, that's a system that we've outlined in all of our materials in detail, so I'm not going to go too deeply here. But the question that you run into is when students first start looking at conditional reasoning, they make what I think is a crucial error.
Okay.
And that is that because they're not familiar with the indicators, because they haven't really encountered this type of like formalized thinking before, they view it through a lens that is the same lens they view the real world through.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's actually a really important idea.
Yeah, and so what ends up happening is they run into a sentence and they're like, well, which one's sufficient and which one's necessary? And since they don't really know that the indicators are as important as they are, they will try to diagram something and say, all right, I'm going to diagram it according to the way it would work in the real world. And the problem with that is simple. You're not being tasked to figure out what's going on in the real world. You are being tasked to figure out what is being said on the page. So if you're applying a different set of analytic tools to that sentence, you're going to miss the problem because you've gone off page.
Yeah. Yeah, you're reacting to something that isn't necessarily there.
Yeah, there's an example that we often use for this, and it's a conditional statement. And the sentence is
I've stolen this from you so many times, by the way. I'm going to let you
it's a great
proceed,
one.
But yeah.
Because
anyone who's ever heard me say this, it's Dave's.
All right, so here's the sentence. The children are in the park when the sun is shining. Now, what happens is to somebody who is struggling with conditional reasoning is they try to think through the relationship between children being in the park and the sun shining. And what they end up doing is they're like, well, if the sun is shining is sufficient, that means it's necessary for kids to be in the park. That's ridiculous. The sun can shine anytime it wants. All right, so there's no way the sun shining can be sufficient. It's got to be the necessary condition. Children in the park must be sufficient. They diagram it. They have just missed the problem. And they've missed it in a way that cost them time because they sat there and thought about it. And they had uncertainty, which is never good on the test.
Yeah, there's loads of consequences.
Yeah, it's all bad.
It's all bad.
Aside from just missing it, you have a bunch of terrible side effects. Whereas when I look at that sentence, I'm like, children in the park, who cares? When? Oh, that's a sufficient condition indicator. I wonder what's next. It's going to be the sufficient condition. Sun is shining. And I just put SS for sun is shining, arrow, and then probably like CP, children in the park.
Can I back you up
I don't
to
think
just
about it.
Children in the park, who cares? I mean, I think it's kind of nice that there's kids in the park.
Okay, I don't even think that.
Okay.
You know? To me,
you
it is just sun shining, arrow, children in the park. I'm on to the next thing. I don't have to stop and think about that relationship. And here's the reason why. I'm not the speaker. I'm analyzing the words of the speaker.
That's
and
right.
my job is
You're
to identify what the speaker said.
And this is the thing that I think a lot of people don't get about this test is you're not meant to interpret. I'm an analyzer, not an interpreter in this sense. Exactly.
I can interpret what they said, but I can't interpret it through my own lens.
Yeah. My deep-seated emotions aside And I have so many.
You do have a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
Many are unhappy.
Don't.
I love taking shots at you when I know you're not feeling great.
I just want to lay down. However,
you'll get your chance soon enough.
I know. However,
anyway,
you're right. This is true. If you're given this kind of statement, the only thing you can do with it is interpret, just process. Here's what it is. Here's what I know. Here's where I live.
Yep.
That's it.
Interpret what they said. Identify their words, their thoughts, so that you know what it is that you're looking at. Do not apply your views to theirs.
Yes.
You can use your understanding of the world to determine what it is that they meant, but you cannot use your understanding of the world to change the meaning of what they have said. And this applies to anything, not just conditional reasoning.
It's true for the test, really, but in this particular discussion, yes.
Yeah, so think about that statement, the children are in the park when the sun is shining, because that is such a great example where somebody who reasons through it and kind of applies their view, they get the wrong answer.
It's so easy to flip that.
And also, look at how fast I did that. I read it, I was like, fine. And as I'm reading through children are in the park, I'm not thinking this is conditional. It's just children in the park. All right, what's going to happen with them? Is there going to be an accident? Are they going home? I don't know. And then I see that when.
Why would there be an accident? What is wrong with you?
Children in the park? There's always one falling off the monkey bars. And kids.
Somebody
I can tell you, this is a total sidebar.
I know.
At the school that my daughter goes to, apparently a nest of bees. Come on. The nest of bees made their home inside one of the play apparatuses.
Really?
Yep. And nobody realized it because it had been like, they'd had a week off for a break. I think it was like Easter break. And so when they came back, this poor little girl was climbing up it. 3 bees came out and stung her hand. And so they had to, rope it off. But I'm like, children in the park, if you ever watch them, it's dangerous.
You are a ray of sunshine.
It's way better than it was in like 1920. Have you ever seen those playthings? They're like 30 feet high. It's terrible. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's just
off that topic.
Anyway, let me add a second point to this, which is, despite the fact that injuries might be caused by elements of the park, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here are things that tell you other things, not things that make other things happen.
Right.
And that, to me, is a huge distinction.
For sure. That was just like
no.
Your
point actually invites that degree of distinction. I think it's a good one.
Well, when you look at this sentence afterwards and you think about it, if the sun is shining tomorrow, what do I know automatically? Children are in the park.
There you go.
And that's how conditional reasoning works, is when that sufficient happens, you just automatically travel down the path of the other thing's going to happen.
And a nice day didn't make it. It's just sufficient to tell you. And this is where you have to draw the line.
Yeah. You just have to follow the words. And that when in that sentence should jump off the page at you in neon. And you should see it and be like, what's coming next? Sufficient condition. All right, I'm going to identify it. Got it. You don't have to think about the meaning of the sentence at that point. In fact, I was able to do that without even really considering what the words were. It was just like, here we go.
There you go. Yeah.
That's how you do things fast. And those extra seconds that I save there, they add up over time. When I get to a logic game and I see 5 conditional rules, I'm just diagramming them without even thinking. Then I'll start putting the variables together. But I'm already ahead of the person next to me because they're stopping to be like, okay, let's see what the diagram is. Faster, stronger, easier. That's what you're looking for here. Know it, make it second nature.
I like it. Well, we agree.
Great. I'm glad you agree with me.
You were too.
That's true. You want to talk about some of these common errors that you might run into?
In fact, I mean, we've talked a lot so far about individualized statements and how to know that you're making the right informed decisions with them. We've also talked a lot, Dave, about the idea of these things invite mistakes.
Yeah.
And to me, when I think about conditional reasoning, the single greatest vulnerability, the single greatest potential disaster is that there are a lot of invitations to make mistakes. And
Sure.
I think we should talk about what some of the most common, what some of the most frequent traps are. That's where I think we should go with this.
So let's do that, and then I'll put a caveat in here, which is in a future episode, we're going to go into more detail with the various types of relationships that are out here. So we're gonna focus primarily on the simple A or OB relationships and the things that can happen around that.
Yeah.
We're not going to focus on chains or even talking about things like multiple, sufficient, or necessary, or unless, or anything like that.
Well, I'm glad
do
that you want
later.
to go there, because I do too.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge part, and it's not the simple stuff that eventually bothers people as they try to get high scores. It's the more complicated stuff. But if you don't think about the simple stuff in the right way, it makes it harder to understand and to master the more advanced concepts in conditional reasoning.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you've got to start here.
Yes, you do. So typically when you're forming arguments, the order of things doesn't matter. You can have a conditional statement first, and then you can add something to it and then draw a conclusion, or you could have the conclusion and then another premise and then a conditional statement. Order isn't really the important thing. We're going to primarily talk about this by starting with the conditional statement, but that's just for the convenience of understanding. That is not how LSAT problems need to be formed in logical reasoning. And usually what happens is there's really 4 basic statements that revolve around a conditional statement, 2 of which are valid, 2 of which are invalid. You agree with me, John?
I don't know if I would have gone with 4, but 3
Yeah.
I would have gone with.
There's 4.
Okay.
So
I love you.
I think you're just spacing out.
Maybe. Honestly, it's possible. No. 4 if you include the original.
Yes.
Well,
The so-called repeat or positive form.
there you go.
That's the 4th.
Therein lies our potential debate.
Yeah, I mean that's really the first one. Well, let's take a look. And we can. This is an interesting choice. We hadn't really talked about this. If we use a basic statement like A or OB,
Okay.
that works fine. We could also use that sun is shining example too. It doesn't really matter.
Well, we use A plus arrow study in the books and the courses and stuff, and it's all the same. Right?
Okay.
Well, I mean, you pick your poison, as it were.
Let's do that, because that's something that people are familiar with.
Yeah.
At least some. So one of my favorite conditional statements is that to get an A+, you must study. Now, that means that anytime you see someone with an A+, you know that they studied. Maybe they cheated too, but they studied for sure at least part of the time. Maybe they went in and they hacked the system and changed their grade. But that wasn't the only thing they did. They had to have studied at least as part of that. So that's part of the equation. Now, what we call the repeat form, I've heard called the positive form, each work great to me, is if you say, all right, to get an A+, you must study. John got an A+.
Oh, thanks.
Those are 2 premises. What is your conclusion?
Well, in this very outlier case, I must have studied.
Outlier case.
You know it is.
True. Just leave it.
All right.
Accept it as the truth that it is that I say it is. All right. So that's a valid statement.
Yeah, I mean,
to get an
like
A+,
we said,
you
real
must
world
study,
doesn't.
and then you know that John got an A+, so John studied. Very simple. As John is trying to make his point here, is that it is not very frequently used on the LSAT. But I will tell you where it is frequently used on the LSAT, because you're right about LR, but in logic games, it comes up all the time.
Yes.
And I can see the shock of recognition and understanding. You're like, that's
you
right.
woke me up.
I've cut through the fog and the haze.
Hey, be nice.
So that's the first one. Let's go for the other positive one, and that is this. And the contrapositive is what it is called.
That's right.
And that is if you don't do the necessary condition, what happens? Something's absolutely necessary and you don't do it. What's the outcome?
Well, there you go. I tend to think of necessary conditions as like lifeblood, oxygen. What happens when you lose it? You're in trouble.
you die.
You die. So that's right. When you don't have the thing that you depend on, you fall apart, frankly.
So if we know to get an A+, you must study, and now our friend John did not study.
That's right.
What happens to John?
Yeah, what happens if I didn't study? I'm in trouble. Well, at least my grades are. My GPA is in trouble. You did not get that A+.
Maybe you'll get an A.
Maybe you get an A. Maybe you get a C. Maybe you fail. Maybe you didn't show up.
But you did not get an A+.
But you know what didn't happen. And this, to me, is really the key of conditional reasoning. There are things you can know for sure. Not a lot. Not as much as people tend to think. But there are things that are guaranteed. If you have the sufficient, you know the necessary. If you lose the necessary, you lose the sufficient.
That's exactly right. And these are the two major inferences.
And let me put a finer point on it, Dave. That's it.
The only two.
That's it. That's all you know.
So, if that's the case, this sounds pretty simple, right? The LSAT makers are like, this is too easy, we can't do this. No, it's not so much
but
the things
that you
can know.
Simple.
That part is, but what makes this more challenging is the way they try to trick you with things that you can't know. So it is not what you do know. That's actually, I agree, not that difficult to ascertain.
The things you know are obvious.
Yes.
The things you don't know, that's where the rub is. That's where things become slippery.
As Archer would say, that's where the danger zone
Danger zone!
I have to withhold my attempt at danger zone.
Come on!
No.
Get in here.
Danger zone!
Danger zone! Get in here.
Although the new season of Archer is subpar. I'm not loving it. Rick and Morty, though, is coming soon, and I am looking forward to that. Yes.
I know.
Can't get here soon enough. All right, so let's continue on to the nerds. Invalid.
Let's focus.
No, there's just one of those two. Around South Park, too. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit more about this A+ arrow study idea, and let's start with what happens when the necessary condition happens. So here, we know that that statement is true, and it is always the case. To get an A+, you must study. Now John comes in, and John studies like mad.
Why am I involved? But I take your... Yeah, I study like mad. What do I know?
What happens?
What happens?
Did you get an A+ for sure?
Me? Probably not. But there are no guarantees. That's
you might have.
Best as I can say, yeah.
But do we know for sure?
And this, to me, again, is where the fun of conditional reasoning is, and also where the danger. We don't know. You
don't know. You can't say for sure, and so what happens on the LSAT a lot is they'll be like, well, it turns out that John got an A+. And you just don't know that to be the case at all. So, to most people, and especially if you're listening to this and this is the first time you've ever really encountered this, you might be thinking to yourself, this is so easy, man. This makes complete sense. Right. Until it's about transformers and photovoltaic power plants, and you're like, that's something that you don't know a whole lot about. Whereas A+s and studying, everybody's at least familiar with those concepts. And this is how the LSAT takes you out of a comfort zone. If the whole test was about things that we dealt with every single day, most people do really well.
Yeah.
And that's not how it works. They give you these concepts that are foreign to you, and in many cases that you really don't care at all about. You're like, so what? I'm always harsh about that. I'm like, I will try to learn something new by taking this LSAT today. And sometimes I do. Sometimes I'm terribly disappointed. But I do know that the subjects are not chosen based upon their interest for us. They want to test a variety of things, and you have to be prepared to see conditional reasoning, not in questions about studying, but about power plants. And it's way, way harder when they do that.
Well, I know, Dave, that you want to get into the intricacies of this.
Not too much.
No? Well, I thought you did. I
sound so disappointed.
Oh, I'm a little bit. I instead want to go broad first, which is simply to say that I think people's difficulty with conditional reasoning is the fact that they want to assume too much.
Agreed.
That I think most people fail in conditionality because they overextend themselves.
Well, they want to jump to the conclusion that this is the way that it is.
That there's this, again, the interconnectivity between things that may be more unidirectional than they realize.
Mm-hmm. And in this case,
that's how I see it.
When that necessary condition happens and studying occurs, some people will be like, well, you must have gotten the A+. And that is to be too absolute or too certain in your conclusion. It's possible that you got an A+, you just don't know it for sure.
Exactly. It's that degree of uncertainty that exists beyond your conclusivity, as it were.
Exactly. And so the thing, when we see that, we see it so much, we actually gave it a name and we call it a mistaken reversal, because instead of it being really A arrow B, you're thinking, well, it must be B arrow A.
And let's talk about its sibling, because I think it deserves mention.
Oh, yeah. That's up next.
Okay.
Mistaken negation.
Yes.
Yeah. And again, the reversal is an invalid form. Just because the necessary happens, all that you know at that point is that the sufficient can happen, but does not have to happen. It could occur. You don't know for sure that it does, and that's what the LSAT tries to tell you all the time. Mistaken negation, again, we'll use our A+ arrow study example. In this case, now we're going to say John did not get an A+.
Yeah. John got a C.
Buddy.
Let's just put a condition on it. A likely condition. And what happens? What do we know from that? From the absence of a first step? Nothing.
That's right.
Yeah. The way that I tend to frame this for people, and it's easier, I think, in logic games sometimes, because therein lies the first trigger, is look for the first thing. If you have that A+, move. If you don't, freeze.
Okay.
That's how I tend to think about it. It's a little trickier in like a logical reasoning question, of course, because you're in the context of just that single moment. You've got 2 minutes, whatever. But man, in games, you have an opportunity to really explore.
It's exactly the case. So.
Thanks, man.
I know, you nailed it. In more broader philosophical terms, the non-occurrence of the sufficient condition has no effect on the necessary. Can you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the non-occurrence of the sufficient condition has no impact on whether or not the necessary occurs. And again, because it's A+ in study. Well, that is how it is. When you have this relationship and it's A+ in study, everyone's like, well, yeah, of course. Just because you didn't get an A+ doesn't tell me anything about whether you studied. You could have gotten a B and studied really hard. Yeah, I agree. It's pretty easy to see that. When it is about power plants and something you don't know anything about, it's much harder to make that same exact leap right there.
Yeah, and coming to the same thing is, I think sometimes it's weirdly hard for people to see, but it's equally true. A mistaken reversal and a mistaken negation. They're the same thing.
They're contrapositives of each other.
I know what they are. They're the same thing.
I realize you do, but, I don't know that everybody out there realizes that.
Do you think the way you just phrased it helped?
Sure.
Okay.
Because I was going to clarify, as I am wont to do.
Now it's time.
So, the interesting thing about the errors, and I always think of this as the spiral of darkness, is that if you make a mistake in a problem, and you start thinking, okay, that something's reversed or improperly negated, the big problem is it's easy to keep on making errors because the two flaws are actually just different sides of the same coin. And by the way, I feel about this as a statement and it's contrapositive. They're functionally identical too. So when you make a mistake, it starts to all look the same, and it's really easy to just spiral out of control with that. But the relationship of a statement and its contrapositive is really interesting. The analogy that I like to use is it's like looking at a penny. And each side looks different, but the intrinsic value is identical. It's still 1 cent. And that is precisely what we have. When you get a statement that says A arrow B, and then you have a contrapositive, which reverses and negates the term. So it's not B arrow, not A. And again, we're assuming that you have some working knowledge of this. All of this is explained in far more detail in our materials. But when you have the statement and it's contrapositive, those two things mean the same thing. They're identical. One is, if you have this, you must have this other thing. And the other is, if you don't have that thing, then you can't have that first thing. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
But if you take a statement like A arrow B and you look at the reversal of that and you look at the mistaken negation of that, you'll discover that those two are contrapositives of each other. They're the same error. This sometimes causes problems on the LSAT because when they ask you to describe flaws, you might think, well, they're describing a reversal. Doesn't really matter. They tend to describe what is on the page, but they don't have to because the flaw is typically underneath the exact same flaw.
You know what?
So,
I hope, no, that was beautifully said. I hope somebody listens to this and is like, what is he talking about?
Well, think about it this way. If that is your response, and what I said just sounded like I have no idea, you've missed some pieces that we've talked about.
You are
in our books,
fundamentally
our courses,
deficient, my friend. My listener friend.
There are things out there that we have talked about, and I'm not talking about in this podcast, in books and so forth. And if, just to throw an aside there, if you're reading a book and they don't talk about that, they should be.
You know what?
This is basic
shame
stuff.
on them. In the same way, shame on you if you don't know what we're talking about. If you're reading a book that doesn't. Shame on them.
I'm not gonna put shame on the listeners yet.
Just sit tight. I'll do it.
Okay.
I feel sufficiently comfortable in saying that
clearly
people listening to this should know better, and people writing books should know better.
Well, right now, it's very easy that a bunch of people would be listening to this who are like, I haven't run across that. That's okay. Just make sure that you do run across it at some point so that you get clarity with it. No. Because this shows how they test you and why some of this could be really difficult, especially if you misinterpret what you're doing.
You're so prematurely generous. I respect it. Kind of.
Well, there's no reason to get all crazy like you.
Come on.
Until the appropriate time.
Yeah, that's right. Until the appropriate time. And then you better get crazy. Cross that Rubicon.
Well, I think when we talk about this stuff, what we should really focus on is that they are asking you to do some very basic things, but it gets tricky quickly. And if you don't approach it the right way, it can be a real challenge. Because if you start applying the wrong view to this, or if you don't realize what you're being asked to do, it's easy to miss a lot of these questions. Yeah. And when we do analytics on tests, we always look at the presence of conditional reasoning because it helps us see whether or not somebody is good at recognizing it when it is there and manipulating it when they have found that it's there.
Yeah, and I think, Dave, not to cut you off, although I did.
Again?
Shut up. I think you would agree with me that this is also the kind of thing when you're good at it, it's free points.
Totally.
Yeah.
And free confidence.
That's beautifully said. I can't think of too many things on this test that guarantee success like conditional reasoning does.
You're going to use it on every exam. You will be tested on it without question.
Yeah. So if you think that maybe we're overly hung up or whatever on this, you're wrong, because this is something that matters in the most fundamental tangential sense. Like in the sense of this will pay you dividends.
Unquestionably. Speed, confidence, points.
Yeah.
The three big things that you want.
I mean, what more do you want?
On the LSAT, not much. Entertainment, maybe.
Maybe. Well, that's what
I'm willing to forego entertainment on the LSAT. But so, frame what this is. This is really a way to think about how to approach conditional reasoning and to understand not just its importance, but how your task changes from section to section and how you are being asked and tested by the exam to know what's there, what's valid, what's invalid. You have a lot of control over this. You can learn all these ideas beforehand, and then you can choose how much you want to diagram or not diagram. just remember, it gets a lot harder when they take it out of a comfort zone like studying and getting grades, and they take it into real LSAT topics. And that's where the leap occurs for most people. It's easy when you know what it is that they're talking about. It's way harder when it's something completely new. But you can learn almost all of this beforehand, and that can make you incredibly fast at it. And when you have that, you become empowered to do exceptionally well on questions that contain this. And of course, as we just said, there will be questions that contain this. Anything to add?
Well, if you wanted me to follow that up, I can't. That's perfect.
Well, you just did. But we will do a future episode where we dive into some of the intricacies of like multiple necessary, multiple sufficient, and chains and so forth. But that is enough for today, I would say. Let's go ahead and call it a day. I want to thank everybody for listening. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. Give us a rating, and if you have questions, send us an email at lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Everybody have a great week, and thanks so much for listening.